I'm Scott Wynn. Today I'm going to demonstrate a technique for shooting the edge of a board. The term shooting means to plane the edge of a board, plane it straight so the two boards can be joined together. There's a number of techniques for this. This is my favorite. I've probably tried them all. I'm sure most of you have your own favorite. If you have any dissatisfaction with how you're doing your technique, give this one a try. This is not my technique. I didn't make this up. This is an old traditional technique. It utilizes the fact that bench planes have curved blades. Okay, one technique a lot of people like to use is to mark the board, flip them, clamp them together, shoot the edge, and even if the blade is slightly out of square, to the sole of the parallel, actually to the sole of the plane, when you open it, those two edges will be parallel and the board will lay flat. The edges will be nice and square and gap free. My problem with this, when I've done it, I find it very tedious to continually try and get that edge dead on there, get a clamp around it, this edge dead on to there, get a clamp on it, go back and double check that one, put it in a vise, shoot it, unclamp it, check it, and find out maybe there's a gap. The ends are wider, or there's a gap in the middle. So then I have to put it back together again, clamp it, try and get that. Do that over and over. I've found this tedious. I know a lot of people enjoy this technique, but I had no success with it. Another technique, and this is the basic kind of beginner's technique, and one which I used for a long time, is to basically just take that board, put it in a vise, and then try and hit that 1 or 2 degree out of square, pass along the edge, do it again at exactly within 1/4 of a degree, and it's going to take 2 or 3 passes before you get the full width of the board, and then come back and check it and see if it's square. It's not going to be square unless you're really, really lucky, but if you got 6 or 8 boards to do for a tabletop, this is going to be a long day, or days. And on top of that, we'll concentrate on getting that angle right. You could take more off the ends or too much off the middle. Another technique, and one which is an old European technique, was often used, and Japanese use it too, though the Japanese usually had something on their bench for it, was to shoot the edge of the board like this, and the board would be held down. You could dog it. You'd have to shim it up a little bit because this part of the plane is not going to cut, and shoot it that way. And even if your blade was out of square on that, or out of parallel to the sole of the plane, all your boards would have the same angle, and you could get nice square and flat boards. The other thing about not using a reference like that and using your plane, if your straight blade is slightly out of adjustment, each pass is going to take more off that side. And first cut will be 1 degree, second cut will be 2 degrees from where you started, next cut will be 3 degrees, and so forth. So even though you might mark your boards and then open them up, if you do them one at a time and you take 1 stroke more off one than the other, your edges are not going to be parallel. So this technique that I'm going to talk about and demonstrate evolves from the fact that bench planes traditionally have a slight curvature to the blade. There's a slight curvature like this, and each plane has a slightly different curvature depending on the task it's supposed to do. And you can see here on scrub plane, We can catch the shadow on that. You can see how much curvature is on that blade. That's a real exaggeration. But this is the first and roughest plane used. And it is usually followed by a jack plane, in this case a German jack, which is shorter than the English and American jack. That's got about 1/16 of an inch. So traditionally, if you were to take a board from the rough, using these two planes, the next plane would be the joiner plane. The joiner plane could have as much as a 32nd of an inch curvature across that. Nowadays we don't use it too much for flattening boards by hand, probably less curvature, but some curvature, perhaps a 64th or so. You can kind of find your own amount depending on the thickness of the wood you work and the hardness of the wood. I think the best joint happens when it's hand planed. You can take a piece of wood right off the saw. You have a sawn joint, but if you look at it under the microscope, you'll find that the fibers are torn, and the whole edge is pretty ragged. And there's some variation too as the saw goes, the wood goes through the saw blade, some little deeper cuts where the blade strained a little bit and got a little flutter and cut it slightly deeper, or you came off the fence slightly. And I've read, I actually haven't talked to these glue manufacturers, even the glue manufacturers say the sawn edge is not the best gluing surface, and they do a lot of consultation with manufacturers who want to edge glue boards coming right off their saws in order to prevent glue line failure. The next best or better glue joint is coming off the joiner, but if you look close at the joiner, you can hold up the light for instance, you can see where maybe you stalled and sped up on your feed, or you came off the fence a little bit, or you had a little more pressure on one end or the other. And there's slight irregularities along that edge. And there's the scallops from the cutting edge itself, and those will be bigger the faster you feed it, the smaller the slower you feed it, and the less tear out. The blade kind of beats the wood down a bit, so that wood is slightly burnished. It doesn't want to accept glue as well as a nice open pore wood. And you've got those slight variations, which sometimes they'll just show up, or it comes off the joiner and it's just not the perfect shape. It's not straight. It might be a little hollow in the middle, which within limits is actually desirable, but it could also come off dilped on the end. So you can run that board through the joiner repeatedly and just struggle with trying to get all those irregularities out. You're probably going to have to come back and touch it up with a hand plane. And basically wood right off the hand plane, it's not oxidized, it's freshly cut, will give you the best glue surface. So for the best quality work, least chance of failure, greatest chance of longevity, you want to hand plane that edge. That edge has to be shaped properly, but once done is superior to all the other techniques. So I have this little bench here. This is actually a plank I found in a basement of an old apartment house, a somewhat derelict apartment house that I stayed in. And obviously it was a bench done in the Japanese style. It had some holes in here for 5/16 inch dowels, which, let's see if this one moves. No, that one doesn't. I don't usually use them, but a few of them are in here, and friction fit. You can pop them up, have a little stop, and friction fit, you can push them down out of the way. But the most interesting thing about this was this rail came on it. And this would be typical for a Japanese bench. The Japanese will use a joiner plane, much like this, maybe a little bit longer, but this is a typical length for a Japanese joiner. The true joiner will have an extra bit of meat on this side because they'll be flattening the bottom and squaring that edge to the bottom. So over time, more material will come off here, and they would set it on, work right-handed. They'd set the wood there and they'd join it like that, much like the European setting it on the bench and shooting it. So I think this is probably done by somebody working in Japanese style. So I put a Rubo hook on it, and I also put these stops on here. Which I can, there's a different height one in the back, I can switch around as stops. But this hook I use for shooting. Now you can't use a really big board or a really long board on this, but it's really quick. You're not opening and closing a vise every time you want to check something. So what I've done here is I've previously squared up this edge, planed this edge down. Nice joint. I don't have much of a, you like to see a little gap in here, less than a paper thickness in the center half or so of the board. This gives you, when you're clamping up, a little more pressure at the end.